Hello, welcome to Once and Future Tech. This is a series that's intended to give us a chance to revisit earlier computing experiences. And while the focus will largely be on software, I'd quite like the opportunity to revisit some of the hardware of our digital past as well. This series gives us the space to return to a time that, for some of us at least, represented a sort of formative digital awakening. Technology, for better or for worse, continues to advance, and human beings are essential to this process. And we currently live in an era, at least, well, for many places in the world, in which digital entertainment is largely ubiquitous. From video games to Netflix to Tumblr, there are entertainment avenues seemingly for every taste. And if that taste does not already exist, it is manufactured, developed, cultivated, marketed to attract audiences. As much as this video series is about specific forms of entertainment, i.e. old video games or software, it is also about trends and people and history. For wholly subjective reasons, I've decided to start us off with a particular childhood favorite of mine, which is battle chess. Now, battle chess was not the first digital iteration of chess to arrive on home computers, but arguably it was one of the most entertaining. Writing on the origins of chess, the game, an author named MacDonald states that no game occupies so important a position in the history of the world as that of chess. And though one of the oldest known games to civilization, it is yet undoubtedly the most intellectual. Now, intellectual perhaps. However, I'm not sure that MacDonald ever watched a pawn get killed by a bishop with a 900-pound weight, or a queen stab a king in the back in the way in which we are graced with battle chess. Now, battle chess was distributed on a variety of different platforms when it was released in 1988. And in his book, Games vs. Hardware, John Procaru writes that battle chess was launched on no fewer than 13 different systems. And these included the 3DO, Commodore 64, Amiga, Mac, IBM compatibles. So there was no lack of platform for playing battle chess at the time. And in fact, by 1991, Interplay released an enhanced edition of battle chess on CD-ROM, and that had the benefit of the developers being able to offer a 256 color version, as well as an accompanying musical score. Battle chess was unique upon its release, and one of the main reasons for that is that it featured a high level of graphical detail and a fluidity of motion that was uncommon in many computer games at the time. It retains a relatively special place in video gaming history, largely because of the people who developed it. It was developed by Interplay Productions, and Interplay was a company that was co-founded by Brian Fargo in the early 1980s. Interplay developed a number of games in the 1980s and 90s that you might be familiar with, ranging from Wasteland to Bard's Tale to Star Trek The 25th Anniversary. Perhaps most notably, later on into the 90s, was the first two Fallout games. Chess dates back to at least the 4th century BC. The earliest recorded name for the game chess is a Sanskrit word, Chaturanga. And Chaturanga is a word that describes a force, or a bala, that is comprised of 4 limbs, or 4 components. These reflect the common composition of Indian armies during the 4th century. Greek descriptions at the time describe an Indian army of 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 200 elephants, and 300 chariots. The game, Chaturanga, was played on 64 squares, and variations of this very early form of gameplay persisted in India all the way throughout the Sanskrit period until about 700 AD. It wasn't until the 6th century that chess made its way to Persia. Here, the names for certain items were changed, but the game remained relatively similar to its Indian precursor. Kings, for instance, were shahs, and knights, or horses as we know them, were asps. Davidson, an author writing in the late 40s, early 50s, states that when chess reached the Arab world, the rules developed to include new restrictions on individual pieces. For instance, the bishop was restricted to a two-cell diagonal movement, and the bishop could not attack anything in an adjacent cell. Chess arrived in Europe in the 11th century, and this was done largely via trade routes from North Africa to a variety of Mediterranean states. The piece represented here is a queen from the Lewis Chessmen, a collection of pieces crafted in Norway from between 1150 to 1200 AD. The majority of these pieces are in the British Museum in London, while the remainder are in Edinburgh. Just as battle chess represents a certain vision of chess that is culturally contextualized, so too were the Lewis Chessmen. You can see some of the culturally specific adaptations that were made to the appearance of pieces, which gave them meaning beyond their Indian roots. The game remained virtually unchanged during this period, all the way from about 1200 to 1600 AD. Most elements of the Arab version of the game were retained. As we hit the 16th and 17th centuries, though, significant changes were made to the game, and this resulted in the establishment of many of the conventions that we associate with chess today. Again, MacDonald explains that in England, the elephant became the castle, or the tower, in 1562. And Davidson highlights a number of those changes to specific pieces on the board. Largely these were associated with movement. However, another big factor was the change that required checkmate to become a requisite of winning the game. Some of those movement changes I described include that the pawn gained the ability to move 2 places forward in its first move. Bishops could now move diagonally across the entire board rather than being restrained to those 2 cells. The queen, though, really gained quite a lot of power in the game at this stage, and she suddenly became free to move across much of the board in many, many different directions, and arguably is the most valuable piece on the board. Chess in the 1600s was largely indistinguishable to the game that we know of today. However, in the digital era, the game has arguably been given a new lease on life. Computers such as Deep Blue were developed specifically to compete with human opponents. Today, you can invite a friend to play chess with you using your mobile phone. But in 1988, we were introduced to something very special indeed, and that was battle chess. And I'd like to show you. So, let's begin. Okay, so here's battle chess on the Mac in glorious black and white. This version was released in 1991, and it's the version I played as a kid. I'll go ahead and get us started by moving the knight forward. There's something about the sound of the knight moving that fills me with a bit of unease. What I'll do now is speed up so that we can get to the first battle. I think it's pawn v pawn. Right at the start, you can just see how fluid the motion is, and how much effort it would have taken, frame by frame, to create this fluidity of motion. Each character is unique in the way that it is drawn, the way it sounds, and its movement patterns. This next battle is a particular favorite of mine because it takes a page from Monty Python. As I said earlier, the queen is undoubtedly one of the most powerful pieces in the game, and here's evidence of that. Unfortunately, the queen is one of the most problematic characters as well because of the representation of both the queen and how two queens interact, such as here. A cat fight, so not very subtle. Anyway, this next one's very good. It's probably my favorite fight sequence. The king is probably one of the funniest characters in terms of his moveset. Here's a good example. I suppose another criticism you can level against this game is that all of the characters are white. You can't really tell in this version, but you certainly can in the color one. The game is also good in the sense that it allows you to set up the board so that you can look at specific sequences between characters. So here's the king v queen. Unfortunately, it's also a problematic sequence. So, using domestic violence for comedic effect. Here's a few more choice events. So yeah, Battle Chess adds a bit of entertainment to an age-old game, right? And it's one of the unique qualities of the game, and also perhaps one of the reasons that it can't really be redone as many times as have been attempted, right? Even with the sequel, Battle Chess 2 or Battle Chess 4000, you know, once you've done this once, it's difficult to capture the magic of the original. Right, well, to finish things off, let's see a scene between king and queen. Arguably, she is relatively inactive here, but the effect is still good. You kind of get the sense that the developers watched a lot of Saturday morning cartoons. Well, that does it. Game over, checkmate. Now that was Battle Chess. And Battle Chess spawned two sequels. Battle Chess Chinese Chess and Battle Chess 4000. Now Battle Chess 2, Chinese Chess, adopted the board design and the rule set of Jiangxi. And the second game was chess as the original game, but then redone in a futuristic and cartoony aesthetic. The video game industry has undergone a significant amount of change in the nearly 30 years since Battle Chess was introduced. And while Interplay still exists in name, and in fact there's been a more recent Battle Chess game made in 2014, Fargo and former Interplay employees formed In-Exile Entertainment in the early 2000s. And recent and ongoing projects for In-Exile include Wasteland 2, Torment Tides of Numenera, and The Bard's Tale 4. But back to Battle Chess. Battle Chess remains significant not simply because of its entertaining take on a 2,500-year-old game, but because it retains cultural significance. Nicholas Esposito, writing in 2005, suggests that computing advancements between 1983 and 1994 really allowed video games to offer what he calls strong ideas. And these included the innovative narrative elements that Battle Chess's fight sequences presented to its players. Battle Chess is also featured in a number of scientific studies, of varying quality perhaps. But it featured in Howarth and Costello's 1997 study of motion sickness, and motion sickness in a very particular vein, those that were wearing head-mounted displays, predecessors to virtual reality systems like HTC Vive and Oculus Rift. And at this time, as now, users were developing feelings of nausea and dizziness while playing these things. What Howarth and Costello basically concluded, using battle chess as the game that its subjects or participants were using, what they found was that the more movement that was required of one's head during the interaction, the increased instance of nausea. In another study that Battle Chess featured in, albeit very briefly, Dietzman and Waters, writing in 1996, were discussing the need for alternative learning methods for children whose intelligence was perhaps not necessarily reflected in traditional educational environments. The authors followed a 9-year-old boy named Aaron, who they said demonstrated an outstanding interest and knowledge in science and mathematics, but that this interest was not reflected in his performance in a kind of traditional educational environment. And one of the ways in which Aaron's parents highlighted his particular strengths was to suggest that before he hit the age of 5, he'd already beaten battle chess. At 5 years old, I was not winning any games of battle chess, and I certainly am not winning them today. However, I think it is an important kind of reflection on the fact that you can take something as traditional as chess, and with a modicum of skill and an ability to kind of narrativize the board game, you can infuse kind of a new life, a new interest in something as old as Kataranga. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would encourage you to visit us at www.onceinfuturetech.com. We also can be found on Twitter at OnceFutureTech. Thanks again. Do you hear that?